Hello world, curses and madness be upon you all my friends. I am Euclidean Vision, the emotional support, and with Overwatch Archives in full swing nice and early, and Echo seemingly teased the very day I'm recording this video, I am ever more excited for what the PvE can offer us in the future. And so, continuing my breakdown of the potential enemy factions and their respective units, if Overwatch 2 is a powder keg, then Talon is most certainly the flame. Null Sector are going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the upcoming PvE game Overwatch 2, but Talon are very clearly our true big bads, driven by individual desire, lofty goals, and the superiority of ideas. And so speaking of superior ideas, let's get into some enemy unit concepts. Talon have been shown to have their fingers in multiple pies of the Overwatch universe, proving to be resourceful above all by utilising every opportunity available to them. And so we're going to do the same to design their forces. I'm going to start with the existing units first and then move on to some new ideas. As I mentioned, they're going to be based in some possibly familiar territories. So the Talon Trooper. As with the nullifiers from Null Sector, I think that there's not really many changes you should make to these. Like, maybe change up what weapons they have available so it's not just one weapon type of like an assault rifle. But really you want to be playing more with their numbers, their positioning, where they spawn from, that sort of thing. But a nice way to make them not feel so set-piecey or make them feel a bit more human, as these are actually like human enemies, is to give them sort of more human reactions, like make them use cover more. There are some sort of reactions to blinking and distraction and rolling away from attacks and taking reactions from getting hit. But I feel the use of cover specifically would be really useful in making them feel more human, and it makes them dodge attacks more regularly, which makes them harder to fight, which I think would really help those units out. So then on to the Talon Enforcer. Are these actually coming back in Overwatch 2? They haven't been shown in the trailer. I really hope they do to keep the inting DPS players in check. Like, the amount of Tracers and Genjis I've seen dive into the face of an Enforcer and just eat it, and then complain about it. Like, no, keep the Enforcers in, they're a good skill check, but we could make them better than just a shotgun guy. Like, do we give them a coach gun, so we give them a bit of mobility and CC? Do we give them like Dragon's Breath rounds so they've got some damage over time? Or could you make that in sort of an area denial sort of thing? Could you give them something like, I think it's called the Shock Cannon, it might be the Shock Blaster from one of the Ratchet and Clank games, which fires almost like Needler sort of projectiles, which then explode, having impacted enemies and the environment. I've got a potential hero concept coming up that uses something quite similar. Could you even give them something like a slug, like a shotgun slug that pins you to a wall if they shoot you with it at the right sort of angle towards the environment? And those sort of things you could have added scaling difficulties to make the Enforcer feel different and fresh every time you come up against it as you scale up your difficulty. And actually, as they are one of the few Talon units with shields, could we give them something like a shield burst to sort of protect their allies, so like the Advent Shield Bearer from XCOM? Or could you give them something like a rage mode, like we've seen with one of the upcoming challenge modes for Storm Rising? There is a rage mode for the units, which we could use when their shields expire. So then moving on to the Sniper. I don't think you need to change this too much. I like how the laser sight works, I like how the timing works, there's nice counterplay and it's nice to play around. But we could give them some maybe more sort of supportive abilities, like maybe a smoke burst, like if you attack them, they then, when they change position, they will leave a smoke cloud behind, or they will stay in the smoke cloud to try and shoot at you, and all you've got is the laser to go by. But you could also then play again with sort of XCOM, and at low health, the Talon Sniper will make a decoy clone that also shines a laser at you, but will not be able to damage you, so it causes you to think about your targets and keeping tabs on positioning. Then we can move on to the Assassin, and the Assassin is one I really feel needs to break out of its set piece sort of pattern. We need to give it more of just sort of a natural style as opposed to keeping it stuck to this dash between walls, dash attack, down person, disappear, repeat. Like, give them some more actual attacks and have them sort of involved in the fight rather than sort of bouncing around and jumping in. You can still keep that sort of iteration of the Assassin, but you could then build up to a new one that uses sort of like long-range dashing attacks like Genji. You could maybe have them use something that seemingly looks like the Shimada technology, maybe make it sort of the Orochi, the Yamata no Orochi, the 8-headed serpent rather than dragons. so you could imply that Talon have finally gotten their hands on the Shimada technology, or you could even base a version of the Assassin on the original Sombra concept, with the sort of like lightning knives and any sorts of abilities that they had in tow for that sort of idea. As sort of a separate idea for the Assassin, you could totally go back to some of those ideas and this incredible visual design to give us a really interesting new Talon unit. And then looking at the Talon Heavy Assault, this is another one that I think you'd just be really changing around their weaponry. So you could give them dual cannons or rocket launchers like they wanted to do with Mauga. You could give them dual Tesla cannons like Winston, or flamethrowers, or beams like Zarya. You could give them close range blades like the OR-14s from Honor and Glory. You could give them like physical shields so they can act properly as tanks, but then they can use them for sort of physical attacks. Or you could even have them having collective mixes of those weapon types. You could even have them having one of their classic Gatling guns and an actual barrier like it's implied that Mauga has in his short story. You could also even have Mauga as sort of like a special type of Talon Heavy Assault that keeps recurring, like sort of a mini-boss who's able to change between the weapon types and use them all, something like that. That'd be pretty funky. And as we're talking about characters that should be Talon units, we're going to move on to our first original unit, the Talon Combat Medic, which essentially you just have them use Baptiste's gun. They've got the 3-round burst and the healing grenades. We can keep the immortality field specifically to Baptiste because that's meant to be his creation. We could maybe give them the regen burst or the amplification matrix, but again, those would be kind of nice to keep as Baptiste specific things. Have the Combat Medic be this quite strictly like heal and damage based unit. But then you could make sort of another unit based a bit more on Moira that uses a heal beam as sort of a flamethrower. So they've got a flamethrower damage model and a healing flamethrower model, if that makes any sense. You can also add like an oil spill ability to this that allows them to set up areas of either consistent damage over time or healing over time. And that leads me on kind of nicely, I think, to another original unit, the Talon Grenadier. Quite simple and based around weaponry and resourcefulness, but again I think that fits Talon quite well. So we could obviously have them using grenades, just timed grenades that bounce around, but you could have sticky grenades as well, you could have cluster grenades, you could have smoke grenades that actually impact how you fight the AI units, you could have concussive grenades like Farah's Boop Rocket, you could even have like a graviton grenade that sticks you in place. You could have a grenade that lays mines, whether they're proximity or remote ones, and whether those have knock-up or not. You could also have like dynamite, so it's a timed explosion that also puts out a dot. And you could even have them using things like flashbangs at high levels, so they've even got CC. And this is a unit that I see using something called the Bomblet Glove, which is a take on the Bomblet gun that the Overwatch developers have talked about, but it's more similar to the variety of Ratchet and Clank glove weaponry, and would help this unit be like clearly visually distinct when you're fighting it. Which then leads me on to the Talon Pistolier, which again, quite a simple unit, but almost like an evolution on the Talon Trooper that's going to work sort of as a mixture between McCree and Tracer, using a heavy damage single shot pistol or potentially dual wielding rapid fire pistols. And you'd have this be a slightly more mobile unit than the Talon Troopers, but maybe not as mobile as say the Assassin. And then to keep up being like overly familiar, the Talon Riot Control, which you know what this is, it's Brigitte. Give them a Riot Shield and a Shock Baton. You don't have to give them all of Brigitte's abilities, but I think you could work into some sort of different iterations of those, like giving them a heavy focus on CC, or some kind of focus on gifting armor, but I think that's something we might come to further down the line. Then looking at something else rather familiar, one of the other Overwatch brats, the Talon Aerial Assault. And basically Farah, or basically the Talon Trooper but with Farah's mobility. Whether you give them a rocket launcher or something like Soldier 76's rifle, so they've got the ability to deal consistent damage and burst damage, or you could have them rely completely on the suit missiles to make it like really clear that Talon have gotten their hands on the Raptora suits, and as I said, have got their fingers in multiple pies throughout the Overwatch universe and are making use of those resources. Again, with that you could then expand on those ideas a little bit and maybe have them play more with the rocket boosters, have them leaving fiery trails along the ground to sort of limit your movement. And speaking of limiting movement, let's move on to something that we definitely have seen, but we haven't seen used against us in the PvE, the Talon Shock Trooper. And the Talon Shock Trooper is the unit that we see in Recall that uses their shock tethers to bring Winston to the ground. And you could play with various iterations with this, whether getting attached with the shock tether slows you down, or builds to a stun, or works sort of like one of the Left 4 Dead special zombies in that it starts dragging you slowly away from your team. And at higher levels they could maybe even use that to dive themselves in towards you, or attach you to other enemies, something like that. That would actually be pretty nuts. But I think you could add some nice interesting counterplay, as with the Talon Assassin, in that the cord can be broken with melee or maybe some particular abilities. And if this is done, you could maybe have the Shock Trooper use something similar to a Tesla cannon like Winston. And to keep up, again, my similarities to existing technology, the Talon Barriercaster. And this would be a unit reminiscent of Zarya, potentially using the exact same technology that is supposedly on Russia's tanks, where Zarya managed to rip her current gun off the side off, and then obviously casts her barriers from it. So you could have this being just a pure barrier caster, that it doesn't attack at all, but it's reliant on setting barriers on your enemies. Or it could be more like a main tank iteration, in that it spreads bubbles to everything surrounding it, like the 3-2-1 version of Zarya that we saw. Or it could have a permanent bubble on it that's related to shield health. I'm not going to use that for a hero concept, don't remember that. And that bubble could then expand as an ability to become a barrier, as opposed a barrier more like Winston's bubble rather than Zarya's bubble, and then that can move around, so providing sort of more actual main tanking functionality. Or could the bubble breaking grant an overcast of shield health, like Lucio's beat drop, to any nearby enemies. So this would be like a very strong tank unit that we'd be seeing. So I think we'd probably get rid of most to a lot of their damage potential. But it'd be interesting in sort of like a CC capacity to give them a bubble that they can put on you, on the actual players, to isolate them, lock them down, like stop them being able to do damage or heal or protect their allies, but also stopping them taking any damage as well. So it's sort of like, I think it's called like a void status in some certain games. There's various different iterations of that. But then, to dive a bit more into the void, the Talon Phaser. And this, yet again, back to Talon taking everything they can. This is a failed Slipstream experiment. So sort of imagine like a glitchy, crazed, original Assassin-esque version of Tracer. Like, I don't know why they've given the Assassin more normal voice lines in the new trailer. I don't know, I kind of preferred how Talon felt to have messed with people's minds to this degree. That was way more interesting, personally. But then you can still play with it here, having these people who are removed from time but keep popping back in and creating distortions that will damage you in like jagged dash attacks, or they could leave behind clones of themselves that then explode and rupture time-space around them. One of my commenters posted a really good idea on one of my Null Sector videos about a unit that could force you to recall. And this would be the perfect unit to do that, attach something to you, or almost, if they're phasing in and out of time, if they tackle you, they'd sort of knock you 3 to 5 seconds back along your time, and if you took damage or had been healed in that time, you could lose or gain health. That'd be really interesting to play against, and it would suck to get hit with, but it'd be really funny. And you could even play with something like, when you finally kill the Talon Phaser, they leave behind, say, a Graviton Surge, to play more with the whole sort of messing with time-space idea. And so then, to bring it back down to reality only a little bit from there, the Talon Cyborg, which would be sort of your melee-focused Genji counterpart, maybe using blade arms similar to his Dragon Blade, and you could take that quite easily into a Recluse iteration. And yes, that was my requisite Recluse mention for these videos. She will come up again. Using her limbs as we see them at present, they could be used for an incredibly adaptive fighting style, switching between spider and humanoid form, doing loads of crazy flips and massive scythe slices with her arms, and yeah, that'd be really gnarly to fight against, I imagine. And actually, looking at it like this, I definitely think that a Recluse iteration of the Cyborg would be interesting to have breakable limbs. That obviously could change the fighting style of the Cyborg as you fight it, but if you're able to, say, break off all 4 outstretched spidery limbs before you actually defeat the cyborg, you can get a special pickup, like the barrier and healing pickups we've been shown for Overwatch 2. And that could give you, like, a super jump, or movement speed boost, or increase your elevation, like allow you to sort of raise and lower your elevation, like in Valkyrie. Like, that would be super nuts as an addition to put on someone. Almost like just like an attachable jetpack. And so to keep on with the still not exactly in the realms of reality, and looking at the extent of Moira's powers again, but looking this time more at the powers that she and Reaper both seem to possess in the smoky ghosty powers. You could use these in a variety of ways, allowing units to sustain through damage, or to create smoky areas to reduce your visibility. You could have them working similarly to Evelynn or Nocturne from League of Legends, in that they use the smoke as very particularly shaped projectiles like spikes or ghostly hands that could maybe grab you or hold you in place, or blind you if they hit you, maybe reduce your visibility specifically. There's a variety of ways I think you could play with the smoke powers that we haven't seen Reaper or Moira exactly do yet that could be pretty interesting. And to stick with Moira a little bit, like I mentioned earlier with the original Sombra Naifu concept, the Talon Synergist. And this is one I'd base off one of Moira's original designs, the very tentacly Moira design. That would be most likely a supportive / tank unit, having sort of like a lifelink or a heal, attaching tentacles to its allies to heal them up. But it could also have a lot of CC with like a hook grabbing you with the tentacle pulling you in, or a bunch of tentacles holding you in place, or using them as almost like whips to knock you around. Yeah, the tentacles, definitely go and play with tentacles because I've already done so and it's always really fun. But then to push onwards bit by bit like a drill, the Talon Gunman. And this would be a stripped back like D.Va analog. Like, again, Talon have their fingers in all of the fucking pies. Why don't they have mech units? Like, of course they can have fucking mech units, whether they're based on Mecha's stuff, or Volskaya's stuff, or anybody else's stuff from the Overwatch universe. Like, Talon can very easily have mech fighters. The Junkers, for instance, like, they can even steal from the fucking Junkers, do you know? Like, Talon can definitely have mech units, whether they are flying units like D.Va, or whether they're more sort of like Reinhardt in being melee focused and using barriers. Like, I think you've got quite a few quite easy ways to adapt the idea of a mech into a versatile enemy unit for Talon to use. Again, whether it's based on something like D.Va or Reinhardt, or you could maybe do something like Roadhog and it's able to like self-repair, or Bastion, or even something a bit more similar to Orisa. And hey, never mind the wide variety of mechs that they could take influence from other franchises, like Gurren Lagann's Gunmen, which have already been used as an influence for Sven's Titan mech. Or you could then look to something like Gundam for more classical influences, Evangelion if you want something a little bit more spicy, or maybe something like Zone of the Enders if you want something that looks a bit more similar to how Echo looks. Or you could go to something like Alien's Forklift mech, just to give us a proper badass bitch. But D.Va ultimately is my real sort of inspiration for this unit idea. And then to, again, ram the point home, especially as What You Left Behind revealed that there is a Talon handler named Nguyen. While apparently it's a very common Vietnamese name, in the realms of like storytelling, you kind of usually use individual names for for very particular people. So I wouldn't be surprised if Talon have used Nguyen to gain access to Horizon Lunar Colony and steal them some moon monkeys. Yeah, that's right, Talon moon monkeys just ulting Winstons as one of Talon's many things that they will take from the world around them to ensure that they can fulfill their goals. And that's actually pretty fitting for the next unit, seeing as the weapon that it's sort of based on, there was a fear that the wrong technology could be used in the wrong ways to enact the wrong purposes. And so this is the Talon Dart Gunner, which will use a weapon very similar to Anna's rifle, which would be able to inflict sort of a long distance poison and potentially like a discord, or what's called like corrosion in Overwatch 2, like the corrosive grenades, like making you take more damage. But they could also have sleep darts, and they could also be able obviously to heal their allies. And then sticking with the kind of supportive units, a unit I call the Talon Flaremaster. And this would be a unit that just uses a flare gun and wouldn't be like particularly dangerous in a combat situation itself. Could maybe have just like a single shot thing that sets you on fire and does a lot of damage, but it's got maybe a long reload. But the main sort of threat of the Talon Flaremaster, it would be its ability to summon dropships. And the longer you leave it alive, the more sort of extra Talon units would get summoned to fight you. And at higher levels you could maybe have these create some sort of buff areas where they lay flares down, and those could even act like immortality fields or something strange like that. Yeah, anything like that to sort of support their units without directly attacking you would be really useful for the Flaremaster. And as Archives made the point this year that the Egyptian government cybernetically modified their elite snipers with optical augments, we move on to the Talon Oculus, which would be a unit that has ocular augments, but that allow them to engage in recon, so they'd almost be like warning units, would be scanning areas with their own sort of group of allies, and before you actually contact those units, if the recon scan scans through the wall and finds you, then those units will be added to the fray. But you can also have the Oculus then, once it's in combat, use like laser eyes, like Cyclops. You don't just have to augment someone's eyes to let them look further, you can put fucking lasers in their eyes, why not? Like if we're going with Recluse, we've got laser mouths, so let's do the whole hog, let's get noses involved and shit, you know? You could also have the Oculus use something like a lock-on or a Discord. Yeah, so almost like a sort of analog to Discord, where they are locked onto you, and then any damage you take extra damage from. And so as they descend upon their prey, so will we. As I kind of steal something from Prey that I haven't played, but it's got a fucking amazing fucking gun in it, the Talon Suppressor, which uses what is known in the Prey video game as the glue gun, which shoots projectiles of expanding solid foam, which can allow them to make cover for their own units, or maybe make sort of slowing fields or projectiles that they shoot at you particularly that slow you down, like when Mr. Incredible gets discovered in Syndrome's lab. Like, hopefully people understand that reference. But you could also have them using something similar to Sigma's accretion, making a solid bit old hunk of glue and then firing it in your face. And you could also have these shoot glue onto their allies to give them maybe temporary armor, or even maybe something like exploding armor, like if you damage them you take damage. That'd be really interesting. And of course, as with the recent Molten Cores mode, you could potentially have the Suppressor, when it dies, explode and leave behind a massive slowing field, or potentially there could be variants that also leave behind a Molten Core field. And so speaking of fields, going to stick with some supportive units with the Talon Officer or the Talon Handler, like Nguyen, a unit that would use some kind of aura, whether that's a damage boost aura, or a shield aura, or even a speed aura, and could have sort of a Discord-esque focus on targets like with the Oculus or the Dart Gunner, where the handler is like, that guy, get that guy, and then everyone gets more damage against them, or even the AI focuses more on that ally of yours. That could even be kind of a different way to apply that as well. You could also give them something like a repair pack style heal, that you see them point at a unit and suddenly they get a device on them, heals them up, protects them for a bit, something along those lines. But then as a weapon, I think you should really give a unit like this an orbital strike laser pointer, like the Hammer of Dawn from Gears of War. That'd be really cool. It would stick out as like a sort of, you know, a decisive unit that is there, like, I make the decisions, this is where the orbital strike goes. And it's then very sort of thematic, and it's got this nice sort of gameplay loop of a supportive unit that can occasionally drop these massive bits of damage that you've got this nice bit of warning around. It's playing with area denial. I think that could be a really useful unit for Talon to have. And speaking of useful, the Talon Omnic Master, or the Tinkerer, something that could sort of be similar to like TF2's Engineer, or the sort of builder characters we have at present like Symmetra and Torbjorn, whether they control sort of little drones, or whether they actually spawn Omnics, and that allows the Talon units to just spawn null sector units, like any of the many null sector units that we've talked about in the last few videos. But obviously, yes, as I say, we can have them placing turrets, but of course you could also have them setting up things like Soldier's Healing Field as an analog to the Engineer's Dispenser, or you could even have them throwing armor packs like Torbjorn's old ones onto their allies. Then a unit I probably should have brought up maybe a little earlier, along with the dart gunner, sort of maybe like an alternate version, a crossbow user, the Talon Bolt, which I see the crossbow maybe having sort of gas cloud attachments. When it hits a wall, it then explodes in a cloud of either poison gas or maybe healing gas would be kind of interesting, sort of an AoE healer. You could have them setting up trip wires that then explode or tie you in place or shock you or something like that. They could have explosive tip crossbows, sort of different from the gas cloud, just literally just exploding. You could have them shooting nets to sort of lock you down in place. You could also have them maybe doing sort of like a multi-shot to give them a big bit of burst damage or sort of AoE damage as well. Or even maybe something where they shoot up into the air and bolts rain down from above, like, you know, classic marksman skill. And then a unit that I will sort of bring up again in a bit, the Talon Architect. Talon units who've been trained by the Vishkar Corporation or are working in a clandestine fashion for Talon. There's a difference there that I will bring up in one of the future videos when I discuss the Petrus forces of the UN that I feel would be officially in league with Vishkar, and Helix Security and some others that I'll discuss in that video. But for the purposes here, the Talon Architect could either be just a straight up analogue of Symmetra, whether just using her gun or her utility options, but you could also have them being a new distinct kind of barrier wielder in a fashion, setting up barrier turrets or shield providing turrets, or using one of Symmetra's old iterations, whether that's Symmetra 1.0 or 2.0 with the photon barrier would actually be pretty cool to give them. It could be quite interesting to give them perimeter fences, a bit more like Watson from Apex Legends, maybe even giving them her ultimate that sort of acts as like a placeable 360 degree defense matrix, which would be pretty nuts to play against. You could also give them hard light weapons, like a hard light sword or something, but that's something I might go into a bit more with the Petrus forces of the UN. And the final sort of Talon unit that I've had an idea for, something that we've seen them use that we haven't seen really anyone else go into, is vehicles. Like, we've obviously seen the dropships that they have, but we could also have them using like tanks, or maybe like ramming tanks, sort of like the vehicles they use in the opening of Storm Rising. You could give them gun emplacements like flying gunships or drones, or like gyrocopters that can attack from the sky and also do like melee attacks along the ground. You could give enemies hover bikes to do special attacks there, or just put regular like troopers on hover bikes, just give them extra mobility. What about hoverboards even? Like, that would be pretty nuts as well, having troopers doing like jumps into the air and like spinning their boards into you to then jump off and shoot you in the face. And yeah, that could be really cool to play against. And hoverboards admittedly might be a little too goofy, but you know, they could possibly pull it off, especially if they turn the hoverboards into like a transforming like sword electric weapon. Same with the hover bikes, if they turn those for like, imagine a heavy assault on like a massive motorbike that turns into two giant circular saws, like the Devil May Cry transforming bike. Yeah, that'd be pretty nuts. And then Talon specifically here are going to get their own sort of little section whereby they can actually have some really, really specific units. Like, based on how Talon operates within the world of Overwatch, we could see them recruit the entirety of the Deadlock Gang, up to Ash and Bob, and have Ash and Bob just as mini-bosses within a level, or as part of a Talon mission. You could also have Los Muertos that you bring into things, and have Sombra replicas, or have Los Muertos with their very own distinct style of unit as well, like I mentioned with the Guishin in the previous video being linked to Null Sector. Los Muertos could have their own troopers or omnics that are similar to existing units but have their own Los Muertos twist, whether that's like flashing with neon or doing some crazy weird shit with that could be really interesting, or like heavy cybernetic augments like Sombra, who basically replaced her entire central nervous system. So again, that leads on, as I mentioned, with the Talon Architect. You could have various implementations of Vishkar technology, or some clandestine units that are actually part of Vishkar, maybe units that I'll mention in a future video that Talon just have access to because they're Talon. You could also then, as I mentioned very early in the video, with the Shimada tech maybe being taken and reused by Talon, you could have members of the Shimada clan. Like, there are various units within the sort of Overwatch universe that we know about, I think, through Heroes of the Storm, that the Shimada clan could contribute to Talon if they have made some kind of alliance, possibly something that might happen since Hanzo has relinquished the title of leader of the Shimada. And then obviously looking at other hired goons, the Junkers, like we've seen Junkrat and Roadhog get hired to complete some pretty nefarious missions before. No job is too big, no reward too small. Talon have very regularly been shown having Roadhog in the gameplay demos sort of among their ranks, or counted as among their ranks. He'd be pretty useful as a mini-boss in basically any level anyway, fighting alongside Talon. And only a slightly connected one here, other members of the Subject program, where Sigma was obtained from by Talon back in time. If there are other subjects, like Subject Sigma, these anomalies of humanity that must be locked away for everybody's benefit, what else is in there? And why did they only take Sigma? Did they only take Sigma? Do you see what I mean? Like, there's all sorts of crazy shit you could have be in the Subject program that Talon could have taken to make use of. And obviously there are the Talon members themselves that could exist as mini-bosses, or obviously members of Talon missions, or proper bosses. If you wanted to make more like set-piece boss fights, that'd be really interesting. Like a mission where Sombra is a recurring boss that turns invisible and pops up to EMP and hack you at the worst times throughout what seems to be otherwise a regular level that builds up to a huge boss fight with her at the end. And every time you sort of reduce her health pool to a certain point throughout the level, she then translocates away. Yeah, that could be so cool and be a really interesting way to explore a boss fight being spread out across an entire level but segmented and much more related to information and your ability to adapt to not having your skills available. And yeah, that could be really fucking hard and really cool to do. But given there that we'd be fighting against the playable Talon members, I mean, and by the time of Overwatch 2, who knows who that could include, what about the NPC Talon members? Like, as I mentioned Mauga earlier, sort of becoming this sort of recurring special version of the Heavy Assault that turns up that can use all the Heavy Assault's weapons, for instance. Like, what about the other members of Talon? Like, what about Max and his collection of pet bastions? Or his ridiculous control over the force of magnetism that you might see in My Hero concept if you click the link in the top corner. Like, any of those could be really interesting boss fights that will then feel really fresh and interesting to come across them, like, without the hero existing. But then you could also have someone like Sanjay using the variety of Vishkar technology that would be available to him. You could also have that fight featuring Symmetra as an accomplice. You could even go to something like Sven from the Destroyer comic and fight against him and his Titan as a different iteration of a Titan boss fight. You could maybe tie in, what if Leonora Botruvio of the Rialto Art Museum? Like, what about Leonora's living statues? What if her statues can all come to life and are like these shape-shifting monstrosity Omnics that you have to fight as part of this massive boss fight with her, or they're all particular projectiles, or they all have specific utilities. Check my Leonora hero concept to see what some of those abilities could be. And then as my final offering to the powers of Talon, I think this one is super clear, and I don't know why anyone hasn't brought this one up before. Moira's White Rabbit of Doom. I don't think I need to really say anything about that, as that's probably a good place to leave this video before I go a bit too far down the rabbit hole. So, Moira's White Rabbit of Doom could be a really funny little boss fight, but you could give it some really particular mechanics, like the White Rabbit from Monty Python and the Holy Grail, being this incredibly mobile, aggressive, melee, tiny hitbox unit that you have to fight. But that could also have some of Moira's smoke powers, or her healing powers, or her life drain ability, or the ability to release orbs around itself that heal it, that it can then shoot as a crazy laser. Like, some ridiculous little white rabbit that's actually like one of the scariest things to come across in Overwatch. That could be fucking hilarious. And so yeah, as I said, I'm going to leave it there. I've been Euclidean Vision, the emotional support. Check back soon for a video on the Junker units that I think will be coming into Overwatch 2, and then my final video on the Petrus forces of the UN. That will be my final faction that I'll be discussing. Thanks so much for staying with me to this point. Like, I really hope you've enjoyed this video, because it's a bit long, but hopefully it's all interesting, ultimately. Like, hopefully these are better ideas than what we've seen so far for Overwatch 2, so that Overwatch 2 can be like, oh yeah, we need better enemy units so that the PvE is fun. Let's make some. That would be really cool to see. For anyone who has now seen that Echo has been released, or is still waiting for Echo to be released when this video goes out, like, she's probably badass. I'm really looking forward to playing her. I hope to see you in the Archives events and the event mode challenges, kicking some ass with me. Thank you again. Take care of yourselves out on the battlefield, teammates, and may the glorious light of Best Girl shine within you. Bye bye.